Let's move on to the next step where we would be using a login service to validate the user ID and password. We have already created a login service which is very simple Java code. We'll try and understand that and we'll use it to validate the user ID and password. And also what we'll do is we'll remove all the old servlet code, and from now on we would only be using Spring MVC. What we'll also do is, until now we were using localhost colon 8080 slash spring MVC slash login as the URL for Spring MVC. Now, after this step, we would also change that to localhost colon 8080 slash login, because there are no other things to handle the request, so we would change that too. So let's get started with the first thing. Let's use login service to validate the user ID and password. The first disclaimer is, because this is one of the first steps, we are not using something called Spring Auto Wiring. If you don't know about Spring Auto Wiring, don't worry about it, we'll learn about it. But in this step, we are not using Spring Auto Wiring. We would directly create the login service. So what I want to do in the login controller is to use the login service. So let's do it the typical way we do in Java. So login service, I want to create an instance of it. How do I do that? Login service is equal to new login service. Good question. Before we use it, let's see what it's doing. Login service is actually almost a dummy kind of a thing. So all that is in here is a validate user method which returns true if user ID is in 28 minutes and password is dummy. I mean, this is not really valid authentication or anything. All that we are doing here is have something to test it. I mean, the thing is, on the login.jsp, we have something called an error message, and we have not seen an error message until now. So let's put an error message, and the error message is when the ID and password do not match. So that's the validate user. Validate user is a very simple method, and we want to call that. So we want to give it the user ID and password and check whether the user ID and password entered match whatever is in here. So take a quick look at the login.service and copy the user ID and password, because we would be typing them in a couple of times. So let's get started with this. Let's go to the login controller, and we already have the service in here created just now. So I'll call, instead of putting it in the user ID and modal, I would want to actually call the method service dot validate user comma password. So if what will I want to do if it's valid? So if the validate user returns true, what should I do? So actually it's not user here, it's name. So I'll change it to name. If it's valid user, I would want to send him to where? Welcome page. That's as usual, right? I mean, the same thing that we did earlier. If he's an invalid user, that's basically the else condition for this. If he's an invalid user, what I would want to do is I would want to return him back to the login page. So if it's a valid user, I would want to send him to the welcome page. Ideally, this checks should have been reversed. So I'll say if not valid user, if the user ID authentication did not pass, then this. Then I would not need to have an else as such, because if this condition is satisfied, then it would anyway return it down here. So once the code comes in here, I'm sure that this condition did not succeed. That means the user is valid, and then I can go ahead and show him the welcome page. So now let's see what would happen. Let's quickly type in the name in 28 minutes. Be careful with the case, minutes, and dummy, and do a submit query. And this succeeded, so it went and showed the welcome page. That's very good. Now what happens when it's invalid user ID and password? So dummy2, whatever. It's coming back to the same page. That's good. So it's showing the login page again, but it's not showing the error message. How do I get the error message? So if you look at the login.jsp, there is something called an error message present already. I mean, this was again a result of our first steps on learning the servlets and JSPs. We had the error message in here, but we need to populate it in the controller. So how do I populate it in the controller? How do I communicate between the controller and the view? Think. It's the, yeah, you're right, modal. So I'll put an error message. What's the error message? Invalid credentials. Let's see what happens. First, let's wait up. Now it's loaded. I can refresh the page. It would send the same old request again. And now I have invalid credentials shown in here. So now I have completely started using the login service. So we have now started making use of the login service. That's our first mini step done. So what I would want to do now is I would want to remove all the controller code and I would want to use only Spring MVC here on, and we also want to change the URL. Let's quickly do that. So what I'll do is I'll delete the JEE part. I don't like JEE. Don't say that outside. Okay, let's go ahead and delete this. Okay, we are clear of that. So that's perfect. Aha, I made a mistake. Actually, I deleted more than what I would need to. Actually, I don't want the login servlet alone. I still need the login service because we are making use of it. So I did a Control Z to undo that, and now I deleted only the login controller. And the other thing is this login service is in the package in com.in28minutes.jee. I would actually I would move it to a package called login. So I'm changing it and press Control 1. Eclipse brings up, okay, please do move, and I can close this. The other thing which I also want to do is there's a small compilation error in the login controller. I have to organize the imports. So Control Shift O would organize the imports, and then you would be able to get the login service from the right package. This is because we changed the package. So it was JE earlier, we changed it to login now. That's good. And also I would want to change this. We don't really need to say Spring MVC in the package because all that we have in this application is Spring MVC. So I'll change this to login package as well. So that's good as well. So we have everything in the login package now. We have a login controller, we have a login service. So that's very good. And I'll also delete these two packages because we don't need them anymore. So delete. Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty neat. I guess now we have well organized application. And the other thing which I would want to do is also change the URL. So how do I change the URL that I would use for dispatcher servlet? I would need to go to web.xml. You're right. So it's basically I want to give it to the dispatcher servlet. So now everything goes to where? To the dispatcher servlet. So I don't need to type in Spring MVC. So there was one page we were using Spring MVC earlier, login.jsp. Let's remove that as well so that now it goes to the login, but the login is now a Spring MVC. What you can do now is you can go ahead and restart the server and test if it's working fine. You would see that it's working perfectly fine. In this step, we use login service to validate the user ID and password. It was kind of a dummy validation, but it's there now. And when a user enters a wrong password, it shows an error message. That's good. And also we cleaned up all the old controller code and we changed the URL that we would be using to /login. So from now on, whenever we type in login, where does it go to? So when I go to login, localhost login, you'd see that the request is now handled by the dispatcher servlet. That's very good. So that's what we wanted. And when I entered some value in here and password, you would also see that everything is handled now by the Spring framework itself. So the Spring MVC framework is handling all the requests, and that's exactly what we wanted to have. In the next step, let's move on to other things.